and welcome to why white progressive Christians and their churches should be political. That's right, I said should be political. My name is Jonathan, and I am so glad that you are here. And if you are alone watching this, congratulations and thank you for taking a rather big step into living out the full teachings of Jesus Christ just by not turning off this video. And if you're watching this as a group with your church or a small Bible study, also congratulations. The conversations that we are about to have together, conversations that you are about to have together, are conversations that many churches won't even consider having. It's a very big deal that you are here. Now here's the way that this series is going to work. There are going to be 3 videos. There's this first one right here, which is basically an introduction to what political theology is, both the academic sense of political theology and the lived out witness of political theology. We're going to talk about what it is not, and kind of some things that kind of scare us away from political theology. The second video is going to be political hermeneutics, which is really just a seminary fancy word for the study within scriptures, the interpretation within scriptures through a political lens. What does the Bible actually say about politics? It's really about what scripture teaches us and instructs us about using political witness as a means of grace to help those that need the help. The life of Christ and how we can live out those teachings to our fullest capabilities and not leaving anything on the table because it's political, because it's divisive, those sorts of things. And the third video is going to be all about the what next. What do we do with this information? What do we do now that we're kind of learning more about political theology, what it is not? How do we live out political theology? How do we use our witness to make this world a better place? How do we accompany the stranger, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, even if it means being political about it? How do we do that as individual Christians? How do we do that as a church? Throughout these 3 videos, there will be moments for you to pause the video and sort of answer some questions, reflect on what's been said, how you're feeling about things, how you're coming to the conversation. It's important for me to let you know that my goal throughout this series is not to get you to think the way that I think, but to make sure that you are thinking at all, right? So even if you come away from this series thinking it's all mush, that it doesn't make any sense, that it's not right, it's impractical, any of those things, at least you've had the conversation, at least for the first time, perhaps, or perhaps with the first significance, you've sat down, considered these things seriously, and maybe you walk away thinking I'm just completely wrong, and that's fine. But at least you thought about it with serious dedication. So with that being said, I hope you're ready, because here we go. Before we get too deep into political theology, let's go ahead and back up to the title of why progressive white Christians should be political, because I'm sensing that it might be a little triggering for some of us. Why are we just talking to white churches and Christians right now? And what does progressive Christianity even mean? So let's dive right in, and I'm going to be blunt. There's probably a million ways that you could define progressive Christianity, and it's going to look different from one person to the next. And perhaps generalizing is not always helpful, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to generalize. So if you hear something that doesn't sit right with you, I get it, totally understand. But for the purposes of moving this conversation forward, we're going to go ahead and describe a progressive Christian theologically as somebody who might consider the prosperity of the least of these, the poor, more important than their own prosperity. They take the teachings of Jesus very seriously in terms of living a life of servanthood to other folks. A progressive Christian is not one that's going to say that all gay people are going to hell because being gay is a sin. It's just not going to be what a progressive Christian believes in. Perhaps, I know this is true for myself, but it might not be true for everybody else. But, my personal salvation in some heaven is not nearly as important as the salvation or the liberation of folks here on earth that are being oppressed right here, right now. The most important thing to me is their salvation, not my heavenly salvation. You might also see that progressive Christians will take part in or support social movements like Black Lives Matter, the Sunrise Movement, the Women's March, all those sorts of things. You will see progressive Christians typically being a part of. Now, if you believe in some, if not most of these things, you're probably a progressive Christian. There might be one or two things that you heard in there that you're like, I don't know about that, and that's fine. But again, generalizing, that's pretty much what a progressive Christian is, and we're talking about white progressive Christians. So a white progressive Christian is somebody who, believes in those things and is active in those ways and looks like me, looks something like this, my pasty, translucent skin. We're talking about me here. So we're going to go ahead and take our first pause here. I want you to think about what it may or may not mean to you to be a progressive Christian. What does a progressive Christian look like? What do they believe in? What does it look like lived out? How do you identify as a progressive Christian? And even if you don't find that label particularly helpful, tell the group why that is. Take a decent amount of time, make sure that everybody has a chance to talk, maybe 10 minutes or so, and then I will see you right back here. Welcome back. I hope that you had a great conversation. I'm hoping that maybe you even have some food, because it's church, y'all. You gotta have some food if you're gonna meet, especially if this is during the week. Saying. But as we move forward, we're going to address the next white elephant in the room, which I want you to think back in time and think of how many black clergy throughout history have been political. That includes absolutely Martin Luther King Jr., Jesse Jackson, Reverend Raphael Warnock, right? Most recently. I'm sure you can think of a couple more black clergy that you know throughout history that have served either in political office or have been political in nature, right? Martin Luther King Jr. didn't serve political office, but the civil rights movement, his stance against the Vietnam War, his stance on living wages and, police brutality, very politically active. And then, of course, you have the Raphael Warnocks who ran for political office and, kind of changed a lot of things. But now I want you to think of a white progressive clergy member running for political office or being out there spearheading some politics. Yeah, you probably can't think of any because they really don't exist. Just think about a couple years ago now when Pete Buttigieg, when he talked about his faith and reclaiming Christianity as a gay man, think about how kind of it was startling to a certain extent, because you don't hear those things from a Christian voice. Truthfully, this is a very targeted study for white progressive churches and their members and their leadership, because if we're being honest with ourselves, it's good that you're here now, but you're late. And I don't really mean that to guilt trip anybody, but the fact of the matter is that black clergy, the black church, has been fighting in the political arena for decades. Literally since the Reconstruction era, you have seen the black church galvanized behind their ministers, their pastors, their clergy in political arenas for their liberation, for their life. In other words, the black church has been political. Political theology has been in their wheelhouse for a long time, because it's had to be, because they've needed their pastors to step up and be political. They've needed their churches to take political stances so that they could survive. Meanwhile, our white churches, even progressive churches, have stood idly by. Why? Well, because the systems support us. The systems don't take anything away from our privilege. So we've not been pressed to be politically active. And even though we see our neighbors being hurt by these oppressive systems, we've been idle. We've been silent. As major themes of gay marriage have come and gone, as we witnessed, police brutality incidences. Literally, the day that I'm recording this, Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd just a couple hours ago, was found guilty. And as people watch that video of George Floyd being murdered, they're beginning to wonder. People like yourself are beginning to wonder for the first time, is my pastor saying enough? Am I doing enough? Is our church taking any stance at all? And so it's good that you're here. But yeah, we're late to the party. And our neighbors, the least of these, the oppressed, they've been crying out for our help for a long time. And we haven't been there from the civil rights movement. We weren't there when AIDS became a huge crisis. And today, as we witness police brutality, our churches are again silent. But not all of us. Some of us are considering for the first time our political witness. And an even more sinister thing has been happening in the meantime. With our progressive silence, what we've allowed to happen is the white nationalist, the white Christian nationalist narrative to dominate the scene of what it means to think and believe as a Christian ought to think and believe. While people are dying on starvation wages, and yes, issues of police brutality and the murder of unarmed black men, the white national Christian to dominate the moral narrative of what it means to be Christian in this country and what it means to believe and think as a Christian does. And they have done so to great success, built major coalitions, literal universities, to push their narrative, which is narrow, which is all about abortion, queer rights, or the lack thereof that they're pushing, and gun rights. Because the more that they can control those narratives, the less we're talking about the poor and hurting people of this country. So our silence not only in effect has not helped the least of these, it's actually hurt the least of these because we let somebody else speak for us and what it means to be Christian, and they've done a lot of damage because of it. Now, I want to be very clear, we're not trying to guilt trip anybody here, but we are trying to consider these things very seriously, the implications of our theology in our communities. Our silence or our voices can be used as a means of grace, especially if that means politically. So we're going to pause again, but before we do, I just want you to consider, all of those movements in history, the civil rights movements, queer rights, women's movements, Occupy Wall Street, whatever it is. I want you as a group or as an individual to consider what it looks like or what it looked like for the church to remain silent, specifically the white progressive church, to remain silent during these times, during these moments, and what it would look like instead for a white progressive church to not be silent, to take a stance, to say something, to stand for something, to help somebody along the way. What would it look like? Now, I'm not even going to go as far as to say that you have to believe that the church should have a stance on these things. I'm just asking you to imagine what it would look like if it did. And then you can talk about what the right thing to do is. I want you to take a good, healthy amount of time. Make sure that everybody has a chance to speak if they want to. This is some pretty serious stuff. I'm trying to be as light as I can about everything. But we're talking about political theology, which is your theology through the lens of your community and the political implications of what it means to be a follower of Jesus and to either engage or disengage from the politics of your community. So I'll see you right back here in just a couple minutes. I just want to again say thank you from the bottom of my heart. The conversations that you just had are incredibly important conversations. Some of you are having some breakthroughs and considering political theology for the very first time, and that's a huge deal. That's a massive deal. Now, we've taken a look at how the church may or may not respond to major national political events. But when I'm talking about political theology, both as a study and as a practice or witness, it's not always going to take place on this national scale. In fact, if we're living out our ministry correctly, that's only going to be a small part of it. But now I want you to consider what political theology might mean. That is, what your church might look like in response to community politics. The decisions that are being made in your community that help or hurt the people that you're called to serve from a political position. So let me give you an example. Consider that your church, for perhaps your main source of ministry, actually has a volunteer bank that you go and you once a month, twice a month, whatever it is, weekly, you go to the local shelter and you help out, or you go to the local soup kitchen to help out. And now consider that your city council voted on their annual budget, and that budget means closing down that soup kitchen or closing down that shelter. Here we have a local community, your community, the people that you love, the people that you have been literally feeding and clothing for however long this ministry has been going on. And because it's a city-run shelter or soup kitchen, the budget suddenly doesn't have place for such things. That's your community being affected directly by politics. Having a response to that as a church is political theology. Whether it's writing a letter to the city council, whether it's forming a protest, to protest this decision. Maybe it's contacting your other churches and talking together and seeing what your options are. Maybe it's having a media conference to speak out against the council's decision. Maybe it's a letter writing campaign where your church members, your congregation, you are taking the time to write letters to the council, asking them, pleading with them to reverse their decision, because the reality is that the people that you are called to love, the people that you're called to serve, the least of these, the hungry, the stranger, they are being hurt. This policy, this new law, this new budget is hurting those people. And if you are living out the fullest extent of the love of Christ, shouldn't that mean you have a theological reflection on what just happened? Because here's the truth. Most churches will feed folks. They're great at feeding. Matthew 25 is all over the place. It doesn't matter what type of church. It can be progressive, it can be evangelical, conservative. Everybody believes in Matthew 25. But the difference here is, if you're only ever feeding folks, you're going to always wonder, man, why are there still folks to feed, right? If your reaction as a Christian and as a church to that council's budgetary decision, which harms people, if your reaction to that is, that's a shame, but we can't do anything about it because it's political, because it's divisive, then what are we doing? But if your reaction is, hey, our council just shut down a community program that's designed to help people, the least of these in our society, we gotta do something about that. That's political theology. That's the witness of political theology. That's living out your activism. That's living out your love of Jesus Christ. Any church can feed people. It's true. Any church does feed people. But I'm wondering, can your church help stop hunger? I can see some of you still aren't convinced, and trust me, I get it. You're still having all these doubts. What about separation of church and state? That's something that's commonly brought up when we're talking about church and politics. Church and politics should never mix. Separation of church and state. But did you know that separation of church and state is not in the U.S. Constitution? Yeah, that's right. It's in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists in 1802, but it's not actually found in the Constitution at all. It's kind of strange, isn't it, that concept is so embedded into our American ethos that it's still surprising to a lot of folks that it's not in the Constitution. Now, what is in the Constitution, because the phrase doesn't appear in of itself, this phrase does. Congress shall pass no law regarding the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. what the First Amendment does say, or rather what the First Amendment does protect us against, is government interference with our religious activities. The government cannot make decisions regarding the way that we worship, who we worship, how we worship. And the government also cannot be religious. The government has no right to declare a state religion whatsoever. It has no right to make people swear on a Bible. That's not a thing. It's a tradition, but it's not a thing. Nor does the government have any right to, eliminate or degrade a religion. And most certainly, the Constitution does not eliminate your pastor's voice to speak politically. Now, you can make the point if you want that maybe they shouldn't. That's up for you and your churches to decide. But it's not constitutional to say that the church cannot say anything politically. In fact, James Madison, who kind of helped write and sign the Constitution, he said this. He said that doing so would deny clergy the very religious liberty and freedom of speech that the First Amendment of the Constitution was drafted to protect. Eliminating a pastor or a Christian or a church's right to speak politically literally violates the First Amendment. The one exception to all of this is the fact that your church is probably a nonprofit, and as a nonprofit, you have to abide by IRS code, which 501c3 organizations, including churches and religious organizations, are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for elected public office. So, the Constitution allows the churches to do whatever they want. However, if they want to remain a nonprofit, they're not allowed to get involved in a sort of political campaigning. The point is that we as white progressive Christians have the same misunderstanding of what a reach can be or ought to be. We view politics as divisive, corrupt, dirty, intrusive, bureaucratic, all of those things. And don't get me wrong, partisan politics is all those things. What we're talking about here is not playing the game of politics, but it is talking about being political. There's a difference between participating in the political system. Being political is, as a church, having a reaction when your city council decides to shut down a shelter. And that's not at all the same thing as playing the game of politics or being partisan. That's not what we're talking about here. But by silencing ourselves, we've allowed conservative white nationalists and evangelicals to, again, dominate the political landscape. They've become the voice of what Christianity means. And, for good reason, that's caused us to be hesitant that they've done it. They've engaged in political theology. They've done it terribly. They've hurt people with it. So maybe we should stay out of it. I get all that. However, we simply cannot allow the white nationalist evangelical church to speak for Jesus Christ. Nor can we allow their way of thinking as to be the reason that we disengage from the political process. We can actually redirect the focus on a moral narrative that, turns away from this whole family value arguments and abortion, which is, that's important stuff. But the people are dying from hunger, and we rarely ever talk about that because we're talking about these buzzword things. We're talking about the latest article on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. We're constantly distracted by all these narratives when the truth is, if we could, as progressive Christians, get behind the moral narrative that's about helping poor people, that's about helping the oppressed, the call of political theology is not about being selfish and power hungry. It's about taking power, but only in the name of helping the poorest among us, liberating, if not abolishing, racist policies. It's about eliminating policy violence and doing everything that we can in today's modern day America, where we have a vote, where we have a voice, to use that voice to help somebody along the way. So that is just kind of the tip of the iceberg when we're talking about political theology and what it means to live out a political witness. And I want you, if you have time, to go ahead and stop this video. We're at the end here. And if you have any burning questions, ask the leader of your group, whether it's your pastor or, lay person. any questions. If you have something that's burning in your heart that you need to say right now, go ahead and say it. And let this be a continuing conversation amongst your peers, amongst your congregation, what it might look like. Maybe not just yet that you should, but what it might look like if our church had a political reaction to some of the things that are happening in your community that is harming the people that you are called to serve. What might that look like? What could that look like? So we'll see you on the next video about political hermeneutics. If you didn't bring food this time, I hope you bring food next time. And now I'm hungry, so I'm going to go eat. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.